Here we are.
Hi, Ranjit.
Radha. Hi.
How are
Good.
you?
Very well indeed. I'm so glad we're doing this at last.
Yes, and this is something I've been waiting for ages,
I
and I'm
know.
so glad.
This is lovely.
So, and there's so many people who've been sending me messages that they're waiting for this conversation,
I
and
know. I can see a number of friends already who are coming on board.
uh, and I think normally you are so you don't go out so much and what should I say on the social media, so
No.
perhaps that is why.
Well, I'm very
So.
happy to be here and looking forward to our conversation.
uh, So let me begin by introducing. I don't think रंजीत जिसको कहते हैं ना कि किसी तारुफ के मोहताज तो रंजीत रंजीत है नहीं, हर कोई
Very
इनको
kind.
जानता है. लेकिन फिर भी I will just introduce you and let me tell you I've been waiting since I started my Instagram conversations in March. I've been requesting Ranjit कि please
Oh
come
my
on
God.
Instagram. We must have a conversation and I'm glad he's finally here. So Ranjit is a poet, a cultural theorist, and a curator. And he's just got another collection of poetry just out, the Atlas of Lost Beliefs. And I came to know of Ranjit through his book I Lalla, and that was I think in 2010, probably a decade ago, when I was researching Lal Ded and I came across this book, and then Ranjit kindly sent me this book also. And Ranjit, in this book, when you sent it to me, you inscribed it for me with the words that these poems have traveled across the borders of region, language, faith to find echoes in many hearts. And I find that not only that, your own words also find echoes in many hearts, at least in mine it does. So how important was Lal Ded a part of your growing up? You are a part of the Kashmiri diaspora. You speak about
Right.
that in your book also. And the book is just beautiful. I can't tell you how much I love it. So
Thank you
let
so
us start
much,
with
Radha.
that.
Sure, happy to do that. Lala was part of my growing up in the sense that she was always some kind of lost presence. She was part of a homeland that was spoken about, history that was somewhat remote. And as a teenager, particularly, I felt that I really wanted to go on a personal search of discovery, of knowing more about her, knowing more about her work. And before that, as a child growing up, of course, I'd been brought up in a way that was just uh, inclusive. It's not that my parents were didactic about their ideology of inclusiveness. It's just that that was my experience growing up. That's the sense of diversity to which they exposed me as a child. So Lala was at that point one of a number of figures that my mother would talk about. But she would also talk about Akka Mahadevi, for instance, or Mirabai. There was for my mother a great concern with these figures of women who had pushed up against the bounds of feudal society, of patriarchy, and who had articulated themselves through poetry, through music, through words that, in fact, did travel across generations, and they survived against all odds. So these were for me the beginnings of this journey towards Lal.
And you talk in the book that it took you, I think, 20 years to translate it?
That's right. Oh, well, I have to say that it wasn't 20 years of absolute rigorous solitary work only on this project. But I hesitate to call it a project because for me it was a life journey, and it is a life journey. So it's not just one more project among other projects. But I had to dedicate myself to it. It also involved for me a transformation of the way I thought about spirituality, about religious experience. So when I embarked on the journey, I was really in my early 20s. And at that point, very caught up with politics of questioning, of dissent, of dismantling orthodoxy. But as the years passed, and I also had marvelous encounters with teachers from different traditions. They might have been agnostics, they might have been Buddhist, they might have been Shaiva, they might have been Sufi in their tonality. But over those 20 years, I also really went through a transformation of a sense of why it is important to have this expansion of consciousness. What is it that happens at non-discursive levels, beyond the reach of words? How do you feel part of some larger whole? It might be social, it might be cosmic. And that really influenced the translation in profound ways. I went towards the translation, away from it, and I came back. And as I write in the book, I was, the translator is broken and remade by the act of translating. And that happened to me.
And you also, I think, would you like to quote a favorite verse of yours, or is that difficult for somebody who's so invested in Lalla?
No, I can tell you, I have among the many verses, one that resonates very, very strongly for me is this one. And she says, Lalla says, "What the books taught me, I've practiced. What they didn't teach me, I've taught myself. I've gone into the forest and wrestled with the lion. I didn't get this far by teaching one thing and doing another."
That is so beautiful. It's a philosophy to live your life by. And I think you do that.
Thank you. But it's something one learns from teachers like Lalla.
Yes. Yes.
I remember that she had to apprentice herself to a tradition, but the tradition also didn't necessarily have place for someone like her, a woman quester. So she had to make her own way. And that example shines out for us today.
And another thing about Lalla is that her legacy and the disciple Nund Rishi and the Rishi Silsila. So can we talk about that and the importance of Sufism and Bhakti traditions for us, especially in today's time when things are becoming so, how should I say, society is a little fractured at the time. So we need more healing, perhaps the same kind of healing that we needed a long time ago when Sufism did come up.
Yeah, I think the great lesson of that period for us, the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, is the lesson of encounter, of mutuality, of going past the particular languages, your vocabularies of spirituality, to see that there is common ground. And the great religious experiment in Kashmir between the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, I think that's really the lesson. Because the way in which Sufi impulses came into Kashmir, where they met prior Shaiva and other lineages that went all the way back really to Yogacara Buddhism, and the dialogues that open up there are still something we should cherish. So Nundresh, for instance, Alamdari Kashmir, call him what you will, was someone who drew on these traditions. It was a syncretic tradition. If you look at the rishis of the valley, some of their practices are the practices of Shaiva ascetics in the valley. They preferred a vegetarian diet. They lived in reclusion. They devoted themselves to contemplation. There was that very strong tradition. And again, I don't find myself under any pressure to put a name on it. They could have been drawing on impulses that came from Iran and Central Asia. They could have been drawing on impulses that had been in the valley. I think our problem today is that we need to constantly mark ourselves off and polarize ourselves. And that is really the tragedy of how we use these religious identities today.
Also, instead of seeking mutuality, as you mentioned, we are seeking, what should I say, the fractures that there are in society and the differences between us. So it's becoming, as I remember somebody saying, I'm forgetting who said that the minute you say us, it sounds so dangerous because then that means there is a them.
Yes,
so
exactly.
That itself is, कि उसको हम अपना क्यों नहीं कह सकते? हमारा.
Absolutely.
It's, हमारा है ये, सांझी है ये. But these are words which we are forgetting somewhere, and we keep talking of only the differences. कि ये फर्क है तुम में, ये फर्क है हम में. And both you and I, we both talk so much on social media also of the feeling that's coming now of being an other, which is something that there never was ever when we were growing up. And I had almost the same kind of upbringing of inclusiveness, and without it, it was just understood. It was never talked about, never said anything. And that was a very gentle time to grow up in also. As
Exactly.
compared to the time now that the children are growing up, they face so many problems. All of them do. And I know parents do also. So, and you said that during this lockdown, you've been thinking about the idea of Ajaib and Chamatkar as a strong bridge element in the creation of a confluential culture in. Could you talk about that? So, what has the lockdown experience been for you? Internalizing, reading, what have you been doing?
Yeah, I think, Rana, the lockdown, of course, has been a very strange time for all of us. But for me, it's meant having to, of course, all of us have dealt with the epic turbulences of the time we are living through. I mean, every day you see how millions of our compatriots are dealing with their vulnerability, their suffering, and we're also helpless before a system that seems unwilling to do anything about this. So at that level, there is enormous capacity for pessimism, and I think we're all suffering that. But I have to say at the same time, as a writer, and this sounds very selfish, but it's also been a time of being able to read, to write, to go back to things that had been left incomplete, or to just complete projects that have been left at some stage. But also the slowness has allowed certain motifs to come up and to make themselves felt. So one of those things is, as I've been working on this book that I am committed to write, Lost and Found Histories, I just realized
Wow.
that we talk about mystical experience, we talk about scientific advance as elements of common ground between cultures. But I also realized that there's a huge common ground in the form of stories of adventure, of magic, of tilism, if you will, of ajaib. And if you look at the interactions at the court of Akbar, a favorite character for both of us and for a number of our colleagues, you see that the choices that were made in terms of which versions of the Mahabharata were to be carried out into Persian, or which versions of the Ramayana were being looked at by translators at the imperial court, you find that often the choice settled on narratives of magic, of magical adventure, of embroidery, of embellishment. And it suddenly came to me that yes, I mean, if you look at West Asia, there's this very, very strong tradition in that Islamic ecumeny of an interest in magic and magical effects and all that is strange, whether it's Al-Idrisi's geography, or if it's the various scientists who are at work who also focused on alchemical effects, on the wondrous. And if you look at the preoccupation here in Indic culture with inexplicable effects, the crossing of great distances, experimentation of some kind, that began to really manifest itself very strongly for me. What was it like for these people, speakers of Sanskrit and speakers of Persian, Arabic scholars and scholars of Braj Bhasha, to come together and realize that at some deep, affective, passionate level, they really cared about the same things?
And Barnali says adventure and music, and with a lot of, I will add a lot of exclamation marks to that. Yes, adventure and magic is going to be definitely magical, and we look forward to that. And this would be, I think you've written over 30 books?
Oh my God, including all kinds, poetry, translation, books on artists, artist biographies. And yeah, so it feels like a large number of books, but it's been over a number of years too.
I don't think it's enough. We need more from you. And so looking forward to this Lost and Found Histories. And if we come back to Jonah Whale, which is a book,
Yes.
Unfortunately haven't read the Atlas of Lost Beliefs. I love the name and I hope to read it, get it soon. So in that there is a poem. You started, in fact, that's the first poem, and that really grips the reader. A plaster Gandhi with sulfur-rimmed eyes stopped me, What substitute for coal and why? You missed the last train, it said. He said, you missed the last and only train that was safe for a man who's left half his life behind. Now, is this an idiom for the relationship between the aesthetic and the political? And for modern life? And one more question, it may sound very trite because I'm sure every older generation asks it, but where do you see the modern generation heading?
Oh my goodness, that is a large question, Radha. But I have to say, increasingly I've been assailed by that question because it seems as if, particularly when I'm teaching, I find that I have to explain many of the frameworks that were very, very clear and obvious to us growing up. To a younger generation, one is to sometimes explain what the non-aligned movement was, what the struggles of the pre-1990s economy was about. What was it like to grow up without 24-hour television? So I've come to realize that our fundamental social, economic, cultural experiences were so different that you really have to renegotiate the question of what urgencies might mean to much younger people. So there is that. So there's some of that anxiety in the poem you cited, which is called The Churchgate Gazette. The poem that opens Jonah Whale. And that poem really also took a long time. Now, you'll probably wonder why I seem to take decades to get anything written. But that poem took a long time to write. Because it's also my way of working. Very rarely does a poem announce itself completely to me. Usually I work with drafts and fragments and notes that go into my notebooks, and then I revisit them, and at some point it all comes together. So that poem had a lot to do with questions of growing older, for sure, but also about what does it mean to really live in a city and to be part of what seems to be a society that's defined entirely by one kind of species. Because especially when we think about urban design, remember that the poem is named after one of Bombay's most famous train stations. It's the terminus of the Western Line, Churchgate. So over the last many years, I think particularly since the terrible flood of July 2005 in Bombay, I've been increasingly preoccupied with questions of how cities are actually very vulnerable. We all know this. Those of us who live in metropolitan centers know that there's one set of problems that comes from human density and bad planning. But there's another set of questions that comes from thinking that we are the sovereign species. So we cut down mangroves without thinking that, changes in tidal patterns could sweep us away. We enact all kinds of disruptions on the lives of other species. Again, we were talking about the lockdown. So many of us have reported that we're for the first time hearing bird song, or that the butterflies have returned, or that various animal species have reclaimed urban spaces. The point is that many of these species have also been oppressed or suppressed by notions of human sovereignty. So the Churchgate Gazette, there's also a section in it which talks about listening to whale song, for instance. So one of my preoccupations as an urban dweller has also been to try and dismantle the sense of human sovereignty, even if it's just for myself. I just like to be far more attentive to the species with whom we share this landscape we've created. And, just as we're talking about democratic values, eccentric and quixotic as this might seem, what might a democracy across species look like? So these are some of the questions. And they go back to reading that I did as a student. It was the last wave. It was like the afterlife of the great 60s and 70s counterculture. So I was reading things like Peter Singer, Animal Rights, or, of course, something that in our generation, many of us read, Robert Persig's book, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. So a number of these seemingly eccentric countercultural questions have continued to be with me, but they've taken new forms or are new sort of cataclysmic urgencies. Very long answer to a very precise question.
No, and just to show you, because a lot of people, listeners have asked about this book. This is the book, and it is available in all bookshops as well as on Amazon and Flipkart or wherever. So yes, I agree. It's a lovely thought, democracy of the entire species. And another thing that, of course, you are a polymath. How many languages do you know, Ranjit?
Oh my God, to varying degrees of competence, I have to say about 6 or 7, I think. Yeah.
I'm struggling to learn Persian
No,
these
but
days, and
partly
I
I
really
grew up
admire.
with some of them. So no, I think we're all as people who are
Hmm.
immersed in language and are among languages. I think we're
Hmm.
all dealing with these questions. Uh, at least partly because you go into a different world, as you well know from your own immense research into the plural pasts of Delhi, for instance, or the larger interwoven past uh, of northern India, particularly. You know this. You yourself consult sources that are in different languages, and a language produces a different form of life, a different kind of world. So it really is something that we need here, even at the level of school, college, university. I just remember thinking that at school, so many people were burdened by the idea that they had to learn more languages. And because I grew up in a rather multilingual kind of family, uh, that was never a burden. It always seemed wonderful to have curiosity about how things are said or expressed elsewhere, what are the subtleties. And I think that's crucial. Again, for both you and me, what's vital is a plurality. And I think linguistic plurality is truly, truly important for us here in India.
Because and to come from there, I would come to Mir Taqi Mir. It's somebody you
Yes,
quote a
indeed.
lot. And Mir Taqi Mir also lived through a period of turmoil, leaving
Yes,
Delhi, going to Lucknow. So I
that's true.
think maybe it's something about that resonates with both of us, especially in these days.
Yes,
And he's definitely
true.
my favorite poet too. And
Right.
so, can you just share with us your favorite verse of Mir?
Of Mir.
And
Oh my goodness.
what Mir means to you, and what does he mean
Yes.
to you? Because I see among the Urdu poets, he's the only one that you quote.
Honestly, again, because I always seem to land up in different places through detours and I seem to take forever to do things. So I came to Mir via Ghalib, of course. I mean, Ghalib was one of my mother's favorite poets, and I grew up with the sense of Ghalib's poetry, his ethos, and all of this. And I signed up at some point to translate a selection of Ghalib's ghazals. But in the course of doing that, I somehow made my way back to Mir. And it coincided with my deepening interest in the 18th century. And I think you'll agree that that century tends to, until recent times, the 18th century has been a bit in eclipse. I think we're fascinated by the 15th, 16th, 17th. Then the 19th and 20th centuries we see under the sign of colonialism and empire. But the 18th century uh, has often been neglected. And I began to realize that, it was a time of encounter which was not already trapped in the colonial framework. Different kinds of people were here. Remember that, people on the Coromandel coast, textile artists on the Coromandel coast who were making they were making textiles for patrons in Iran. Textile makers in Gujarat were making things for clientele and patrons in Egypt. There was trade with China. There was trade with Europe. There was a Surat, Antwerp trade route. Artworks from here were landing in Europe. European artworks were landing here. And there were patrons and artists and writers of all kinds who were active through the subcontinent. They worked in and across languages, and they were not constrained geographically. And at the same time, it was a time of incredible turbulence. So I find that a very attractive century because in many ways it's like our own. It was a transcultural century. It was a century of globalization. Somehow we talk about globalization as if that just happened, 20 years ago or 25 years ago. The further back we look in our own history, what do we see? We see global trade routes. We see strangeness being responded to and being assimilated, being absorbed. So for all these reasons, I really find that century very, very suggestive for us. And Mir I realized almost more than Ghalib is someone who is making his aesthetic journey through these immense experiences of
Yes.
displacement, of violence, of invasion. I mean, you know this as Delhi's historian. You know this much better than most of us. I mean, he lived through the Abdali, the Durrani invasions, which really disrupted the life of that civilization. Socially, culturally, in terms of architecture, it just shook the basis of existence, forcing him then to move eastward to Awadh, to Lucknow. So, what was it like for this man to yet continue to hold on to his explorations? That's something that's fascinated me. And I'll read one of these shares. Also, by the way, whilst I was working on Mir, the share, and I hate to call it the couplet because that somehow makes it seem a little lightweight, but the two-line unit really began to become luminous for me because it just held a whole world of experience. For reasons that both of us know and many of our listeners too will know, the ghazal is not necessarily a sequential narrative kind of poem. That's not what it's meant to do. It's not designed to do that. It's designed to open up horizons of expectancy and anticipation, and it works best in oral culture. When you put it down in print, and especially in translation, all the magic's given away at one shot. And I've found in translation that it seems to work much better for me to work with individual shares, and they then become like a talisman that opens up the rest of the poem. So here's one that holds great meaning for me, and I'm just going to read it. क्या जानूं लोग कहते हैं किसको सुरूर ए कल्ब, आया नहीं ये लफ्ज़ तो हिंदी ज़ुबान के बीच. How would I know what folks call the heart's pleasance? That fancy word hasn't made its way into Hindi yet.
And
I like this because it also shows us a language artist at work. And it also speaks to the very unfortunate politics of language that we are caught up with now, where, for one thing, we've given languages a communal or a religious color, which they didn't have previously. We've also managed to divide what I would call Hindavi against itself. We've polarized and divided this linguistic spectrum. I really prefer to see Hindi as a spectrum of languages, a continuum of languages, and not as a hierarchy of so-called dialects and so forth. Yeah. So this poem, which was written obviously at some point in the 18th century, tells us a great deal. As far as he's concerned, he's not calling his language Urdu necessarily. It just says Hindi Zuban ke beech. I mean, that's for him, it's Hindi. So we need to get away from creating names for languages that then stand in for ideological conflicts. We need to embrace these larger worlds of language. And I also like the way he's, being subtly ironic about the way in which this language was being formed in his own time. Because as you know, Mir often adopts usages that no longer exist in Hindi, but they come from Braj or they come from Awadhi. He's very, very close to the language of the street, of the village, the potter, the soldier. But he's also incredibly aware, and he's erudite, so he's very aware of Persianate borrowings. So he says, he comes up with this notion of surur e kalb, and then he says, wow, that's very posh. I don't know what that means because it's not come into my language yet. So I just find that lovely. It's the poet at work.
That's what I love about him, his tongue-in-cheek humor. And also, when I was growing up in Lucknow, our house was just opposite the place where he's said to have been buried. Now, of course,
my goodness,
there's a railway station
railway
there,
lines,
so the railway line, so it's got demolished. But there was a memorial made to him with the verse "Sirhane Mir ke aahista bolo." So he was a part of my growing up, and my mother would quote a lot from him, and I always felt he was very invested in whatever he was writing. He felt each word. He wasn't detached. It wasn't an intellectual thing for him that that's an intellectual project that he's trying to write something to show off his mastery over the language. He seemed to feel each word, and that is why I think he speaks to all of us and touches our heart somewhere. So
absolutely,
So,
But also
and
the poems have, Rana, after you.
No, please continue. Please continue.
Oh, no, I was just going to say that there's a tendency among scholars to talk about the ghazal as being a world in itself, bound by conventions and so on, which it indeed is. Of course, it has its own aesthetic discipline, but it's by no means cut away from the rough and tumble, the thrum of everyday life. And you read the poems and you know this. There are references to exile, to cities being destroyed, to the excluded and the marginalized, to people marching, and people marching without knowing where they're going. So some of these verses have been so alive to me in these last few months. So we're looking at someone who is as modern a sensibility as any of his contemporaries in Europe. I feel, when I think about the Urdu poets, I also think that we have had a pedagogical conspiracy against them. And this goes back really to the post-1857 period. I think there was a great turning away, honestly, from the life world of Urdu poetry. There was a sense that since it belonged to a defeated empire and a defeated culture, maybe it needed to be modernized and reformed, which often meant throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And as the 20th century progressed, I think we tended to really tie all this up into some time warp, which was set aside, which was seen as pre-modern in some ways. But when you read Ghalib, when you read Mir, when you read Zauq, Sauda, you name it, and you find there is, the qualities of self-questioning, of self-irony, of doubt, of iconoclasm, of dissent, of questioning. Tell me that these are not the characteristics of a modernist sensibility. Yeah. Now take Ghalib, for instance. I mean, this man was the contemporary of Whitman, of Baudelaire. We don't think about this. We somehow keep him in his time warp, whilst his contemporaries in Western Europe or the US are seen to be properly modernist or modern figures. I think we have to revisit and rethink these frameworks.
And as Ralph Russell says, that had he been translated in English in his time, he would have been far more famous than Shakespeare was. That's
absolutely, yeah.
That's a quote that is given at the entrance of Ghalib's Haveli in Delhi. And,
right.
So that's absolutely true. And also because they stayed in one language, it's only now that they're getting translated.
Correct.
And that point is the point that you made, that's a very pertinent point, that it was linked to a defeated empire and a defeated culture. And now we are trying to link it to a particular religion and trying to, color it with, see it with a communal lens. So
yes.
That again is acting against, though I wouldn't say that Urdu is not popular. I think Urdu is extremely popular. It's the script which is suffering.
That's true. But that also comes from, I think, fundamentally an idea that comes out of European Romanticism, where you feel that there's some insoluble link between a language and a script. For some reason, this is one of the things I've been thinking about a lot during these months of lockdown. The way in which we've trapped ourselves in linguistic problems that could have been avoided. We've produced so much animosity and antagonism in this country for no reason at all. For instance, we've wedded ourselves to the idea, to the myth that, every language has some kind of unique script. That's simply not true. It's historically not true. Or we believe that standard languages are those that have a clear script, and languages that don't are somehow dialects, or they're less evolved. So what this does is to really put in jeopardy many, many rich literary traditions which have survived and flourished in oral traditions, in performance, in theatrical narratives, for instance. So these are the problems that we have to address as we go along. I mean, we are a subcontinent with many problems, but this speaks to our questions of identity. Now, we talked about how Urdu has been set in a box of its own, but it's also true, for instance, of a language like Braj Bhasha. which again, the minute you say it, most people assume, right, this was a language of the Hindi heartland, whatever the Hindi heartland might be. Again, these are relatively recent ideas. If you look back at the history of Braj, and you know this, it had a pan-Indian circulation. I mean, I live in Bombay. In what's the heritage of our state here? Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj had a court poet who wrote in Braj. He also wrote a stuti of Shivaji in Braj. Braj was spoken far afield. It was spoken and written in Hyderabad, in Tanjavur. We have now trapped ourselves in some idea of, one region, one language. And, this is going to narrow our cultural possibilities. It's going to weaken us, not strengthen us. And it also means that we're turning away from our own heritage.
Yes. I remember a conversation with Professor Shamsur Rahman Farooqi Saab. I was, I think, in Daulatabad or somewhere, and I had asked him a question and he called me up to give me the answer. So it was a very bad connection. I was on top of the fort. And I had asked him about how many words there are for love in Urdu. And he called me and he said, Rana, there are 18 words. And one of the words he said was prem. And I said, sir, ये तो हिंदी का लफ्ज है. And he said, हिंदी क्या होती है? यही तो हिंदी है. He said, यही ज़बान है. And this was, I think, a conversation that took place about 4 or 5 years ago. And he said, हिंदी और उर्दू एक ही चीज़ है. And then
that's the point.
Exactly. And when he started listing, then prem was one of the 18 words which he said is a part of
of course, Rana, as you know, a great form of Sufi romance is called the Premakyan.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
But the first thing that comes to your mind when you hear of, because our ears have got so used to these distinctions and these differentiations, that when he said prem, the first thing that came to my mind was कि prem तो हिंदी का है, तो उर्दू का लफ्ज नहीं है. And then of course, he corrected me and said, ज़बान तो एक ही है. So that's the point that you are making, and that's such a beautiful point. Languages are meant for all, and they cannot be either associated with one particular region, community, or anything like that. It's just a beautiful language, beautiful thing that everybody should love.
Yeah, and it allows us to expand our consciousness in unpredictable ways, I think, sometimes. Yeah.
So a lot of people are asking questions. We have not set a time for ourselves. We are going to take a lot of time to talk to each other.
Sounds good.
And we'll answer every question. So I have 2 more questions for Ranjit. After that, we'll take your questions. Now, curation is a big part of your work and what you do. And I've seen 2 of your, one exhibition here I saw in Delhi, and I've seen a brochure of another one. It's beautifully done. So just tell us, walk us through, what is it when you curate? I'm sure you must be getting many offers, but what is it that draws you to the particular curation, that this is what you want to curate? And when you curate, how do you work? This is something that whoever wants to get into curation or for art history students is going to be something that is going to help them a lot.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Let me begin by saying, Rana, that I belong to a generation of curators that was autodidactic. I mean, we really were systematically self-taught. And that's because there was no discipline called curatorial studies at the point. That is a relatively recent development. So for many of us, we were inspired by the work of curators like Auqui and Resor, or Hans Ulrich Obrist, Catherine David, or Hu Han Ru. Now these sort of curators of the turn of the century, because many of them came into their own really in the early years of the 21st century. All of these people came from other fields, whether it was political science or philosophy or literature or theater. And what brought them to curating was a sense that there were intellectual problems or political urgencies that needed to be responded to, or major aesthetic questions. So the exhibition was one form of looking for solutions, of opposing the problem. So it was never really about just bringing a kind of ensemble of objects together. And that is also how my own journey began in curating. I mean, I began to write for the Times of India as art critic, again at an obscenely early age. I was 18 or 19. And was there part of a set of critics of different ages who were all launched under the direction of Shanta Gokhale, who was the editor of the Arts page. This was 1988. So that period for me was a crucible. It was really a testing ground for many different ideas and questions. And as I continue to write reviews, later essays, papers, other kinds of publications, at some point it came to me that maybe I should show rather than tell. And maybe there were certain things that could be demonstrated as an exhibition by simply bringing about a juxtaposition of certain kinds of artworks. And that becomes the argument. The exhibition becomes an argument. It becomes a proposition. So that has always been key for me. So, for instance, if I'm thinking about like the Sacred Everyday, which I think you saw in Goa.
Yes, I did. Yes.
Yeah. Now, for me, that was about engaging with something that has preoccupied me on a long-term basis, and which you know, which is the question of cultural confluence. How is culture really produced out of the coming together of dissimilar energies? How do very different cultural imaginations come together and produce something that couldn't have been predicted? And how does that play out in different media? So the Sacred Everyday was really about this, about a syncretic imagination, about how there was a feedback loop between idea, image, emotion, and the gathering of human beings. You know, I mean, you remember the show. So it had, for instance, calendar art, where why did I bring that into the ambit of an art exhibition, even if the artists were anonymous or below the radar in some way? To make the point, as Christopher Pinney, for instance, has done, that far from being demotic or low-level art, the calendar is where people have, through the 19th and 20th centuries, imagined their larger cultural selves. How does that play out? It's these larger questions for me. So the artwork to me is one element in a larger cycle of relationships and transactions. Or, for instance, the images that I showed in Sacred Everyday, which talk about how the Burak and Kamadhenu come together.
Yes,
how do they form a hybrid image, you know? Yeah, so on the one hand, the lineage of that image goes back to Ibn al-Arabi, to Meccan revelations. On the other side, it goes back into Hindu myth, the wish-fulfilling cow, images of abundance and adventure and enlightenment. How do they come together? How do artists free themselves from prior orthodox frameworks and produce something that is new and adventurous? So these are the questions that have always excited me. So that's one of my driving inspirations when I curate. Also, I'm deeply interested in looking at individual journeys that artists have taken. So the retrospective, and over the last 20 years or so, I've worked on a number of retrospectives of Jahangir Sabawala, a mid-career survey of Atul Dodia, Shakti Burman, more recently Jogen Chaudhary, a certain moment in Al-Qazi's work, the unknown Al-Qazi, the painter, not the Al-Qazi everybody knows as dramaturg and theater person. So in those instances, I find it very congenial and very illuminating for me as a researcher to go deep into the biography of an artist. What are the patterns that we see in their work across phases? What were they open to? What were their conversations? I think these are interesting ways of deepening our sense of the work of individual artists, but we also learn a great deal about their contexts, and we thus make our own art history through the exhibition.
And that I have also seen your Al-Qazi exhibition here in Delhi. So I've seen two of them,
indeed.
Actually.
Right.
And I remember you kindly showed it to me. So that was again a beautiful experience. As I saw the Goa
The Sacred Everyday. Yes.
Yes. So I'm sure those there must be quite a lot of art history students here, because I got messages from them. And yes, indeed, Ali is saying the exhibition as an agent is a lovely argument. It is.
Okay.
To come back to your book, Lal Ded, I Lalla, you write in that, why you have translated one of her verses, prune the weeds from your heart's garden, and the narcissus will bloom for you. Now, this is something that is a philosophy I see emanating from your work. It's something that I also believe in, that, you know, try to improve the things around you. And your
Correct.
words always give me a lot of solace, especially, and you are a defender of cultural and articulate defender of cultural freedoms against the monopolistic claims of the state. So, and the religious pressure groups and censors, whether official or self-appointed. So what gives you the strength to wade through social media's toxicity without losing your grace and wisdom? That is
Oh
something
my
that, you
God.
know,
Radha, you're very kind, because I think there are among us many, many activists who have been infinitely more courageous. Many of them have paid, as we know, with their life and their
yes.
liberty. So, I mean, I see myself as really someone who's part of this far larger body of dissent, I would say. And there are people who've really done far more. And I think that we all need to contribute to this, because it's the only way we can retain our claim on what we believe our country should be. You know, when we were children, occasionally there would come along the essay topic, the India of your dreams, right? It all seemed a bit silly when you were a kid. But today there's no question that is more serious. What is the India of our dreams? And, you know, when I was growing up, the idea of India was not current. You know, it really took off after Sunil Khilnani's marvelous benchmark book. But we were brought up with an idea of India, and it's worth fighting for. And to me, that is crucial. I mean, whatever platforms of articulation we have, we need to put forth this point of view. We can't simply give in and just allow this idea of India to be steamrollered, because it's not just an idea, it's a visceral experience. It is inclusive, it speaks of solidarity, it speaks of equity and justice. And these are not claims, these are not values that we can simply give up, because then we would be betraying our own tradition, which is a liberal tradition.
A
And
word
about
which
social
is,
media, sorry, Lana.
no, and I said, as far as the word liberal, that is also sought to be maligned these days.
Yes, I know all these have become bad words now, but it also strikes me that as liberals or as people of inclusion, I mean, even the word secularist can have multiple interpretations. But I think that over the last 20 or 30 years, we have also been guilty of ceding important areas of experience to the other side. And, you know, many, many years ago in a conversation, Ramchandra Guha, the historian, said this to us, that you cannot go on ceding ideas of the nation, for instance, or belief to the right. And I believe that to be true. I mean, there are things that are important to us, which we shouldn't simply hand over on a platter in a way that they get distorted and they get turned into very malevolent ideas. But then we're partly to blame if we just keep seeding these notions. And for instance, the ground of faith, the question of belief, it can be transformative. It can be redemptive. If you're constantly going to see it as fundamentally negative, then you're also going to lose aspects of it which are profoundly important for the expansion of consciousness, for the expansion of justice even. We began by talking about the Sufi and the Bhakti movements. Now, whatever orthodox shapes some of them have now taken over a period of time, they began as forces of resistance. And we need to recover that kind of spirit. We need to be open to those moments. You, for instance, know how democratic a space like a dargah can be. A dargah, a ziyarat, certain kinds of gatherings which yet retain a bhakti spirit, certain aspects of the larger Buddhist ecumeny. We can't really give up on those aspects of the religious imagination. Because then we would be guilty of a binary of our own.
Absolutely. And as you said, once when we love our country, then it's worth fighting for.
Yeah,
It's
indeed.
so there is. I open the floor now for questions. So those of you who have, there were a couple of questions on top. I'll just go back. I'm scrolling through the questions.
Okay.
Okay. So Ali Akbar Mehta has asked, how can translation facilitate understanding without taking agency away from those who use language as an agency of counter-hegemonic discourse?
Okay. For me, translation is an emancipatory gesture. And I think that there are ways in which translation can go past a created meaning. Sometimes, for instance, retranslating texts that already exist for us in stable, authorized translations can help us to read against the grain. And to me, reading against the grain is an important, to use Ali's term here, it's an important counter-hegemonic gesture. And it's happened in the history of translation. For instance, even now, when you read the admittedly highly specialized discourse of Talmudic scholars or, biblical hermeneutics, questions might pivot around just the translation of one word, which transforms the meaning of a passage. And you might just find that a completely different kind of life world is being opened up. So for me, translation is something that constantly keeps that spirit of inquiry going. It's not about the production of once and for all texts. Even Lalla, take Lalla. I mean, and I honor the previous translations of Lalla in my bibliography because so many people have addressed themselves to her works. This is a continuous journey. There will be future translations of this text. In fact, as new Lalla material becomes available, new forms of looking at that material, new reasons for looking at it, as these come into play, every generation will probably produce its own new translation. I, for instance, grew up with Constance Garnett's beloved translations of Dostoevsky. We now know from more recent translations that there are problems with that translation. They needed to be redone. I'm happy to live with different versions of a translation. I will always remember the Garnett because those are the words that have become part of my consciousness. But I'm going to be open to new translations too. I would say the translation is counter-hegemony. That's my response in brief.
And Ali has one more question. Could we comment on the politics of translation, as we know that language in India divide not only linguistic sensibility, but also the sensibilities across caste and class?
Indeed, yeah. This opens up the larger question, of course, of why we need translations to go every which way. Because normally when we think of translation, we're thinking of translating a large number of now here we come to a translatorial question. What am I going to call them? I will certainly not use that terrible word vernacular because it's pejorative of languages. But am I going to say Indian languages? Why would I say that? Because English is an Indian language too. Or am I going to say bhashas? Am I going to reach back into the Sanskrit tradition and call them Desha Bhashas? You see, already in trying to answer Ali's question, I'm raising a number of problems in the way in which we think about the language question here. So in brief, let me just call them regional languages for now. Our basic model for translation is bringing works over from these languages into English. It doesn't have to be the only or even the dominant mode. We need far more translations that go, for instance, from Urdu into Tamil, or Bengali into Gujarati, or Marathi into Dogri. I mean, all this might sound a bit eccentric right now, but it's not like it hasn't been done. This kind of transfer of linguistic treasures has happened before. It happened throughout the early 20th century. And the Sahitya Academy, an institution that comes in for a lot of stick from people, let me say in its defense that it has done a lot of very good work in this sector, but it needs help. Translation is not simple. We need to invest far more resources into translation. And when we get there, we should, as Ali suggests, be attentive to what kinds of texts go across. Texts by Dalit authors, texts by people from, I'm not going to use that word tribal, again, I find it pejorative, but people from communities of, say, rural anchorage, women of Dalit heritage. There are any number of marginal, historically suppressed groups who are writing, who've articulated themselves. We need to hear from them. We need to hear from them in translation, and we need to enrich our literary as well as our political sensibility by doing this.
Absolutely. And I hope people do come forward with more and more translations. And when you said, say, from Marathi to Dogri, it opens up so many possibilities, because in our mind, we only think of, say, from Marathi to English or from English to Marathi. But
exactly.
Trans-regional is something which is also very important, especially for people who would only know the language of their region.
Exactly.
So it opens up a lot of possibilities and sounds very beautiful. I hope those who are hearing, we've got quite a large number of audience today, that some of you do take up these projects. There's another question by Videshwari. Since you are immersed in the visual arts world, in the sense that you write about art and artists, how do you practice writing poems that can bypass the layers of image making through poetry?
I love that question, because actually in recent times I've been opening myself up also to things that have really been part of me, but they haven't necessarily come in a conscious way into my poetry. So even in Jonah Whale, for instance, there's a certain degree of experimentation with musical cadence, with the heritage of certain forms of music. There's a poem in Jonah Whale, for instance, where the Bandish lines of Thumris and Chetis are brought into play. They're used to cut across what is otherwise a narrative that comes from Herman Melville. So it's a way of thinking about how these songs and these song lines, these Bandish lines, are not just aesthetic jewels. They are aesthetic jewels, but they speak from an immense history of juridical violence, of displacement, of cycles of drought and famine, and people moving away to work. There are histories of labor that are encoded there. So for me, music is one of those, if you will, non-visual image sources. I've also really for the longest time been immersed in an appreciation of what's sometimes called minimalist music, although it's not a very useful term. But the music of people like Steve Reich, for instance, whose work I've loved, Brian Eno in his own experiments with the relationship between the found and the made, between sound and music, Terry Riley. So all of that has informed my more recent work in poetry. I've also been looking at ways in which I might loosen up the syntax of my own language. And this is where, again, translation is, for me, a key discipline as a poet. This immersion in Urdu poetry, for instance, has opened up new syntactical possibilities for me. As you know, in Urdu, there are many ways in which one can achieve meaning, sometimes by reading the line against itself. I mean, Mani Afirini is crucial to Urdu. It's not very easy to achieve in English. But how might one play with punctuation, with mise en page, with moving words around in ways where they face forward and back? These are the kinds of challenges that interest me greatly now as a poet. And they have a lot to do with, yes, sorry, Rana.
We've got 10 seconds left. So when this goes off, all those who are here will be back again. We'll reconnect. So don't go away. Do come and join us again, because this is going to go. So I hope all of you are still here. I am just reconnecting. I'm just waiting for Ranjit to come back. This is one problem that we have. ये लगाओ, ये तार कहाँ लगा पीछे में? So Ranjit, I've sent you the invite again. Hello, all of you. I hope you're back. Thank you, Vinita. Yes, I've been waiting for this conversation for a long time. Just waiting for him to come back, and I've sent the invitation. This is the biggest problem of a conversation on Instagram, that it at the minute it's 1 hour, it just goes off.
Rana?
This
Hi.
the problem that we have on Instagram is that within an hour the conversation gets cut in
I
between.
know, I know.
But I prefer the audience here. Audience here is really great. So I love Instagram conversations much more than Facebook. Just before we got cut off, there was a question by Mir Mukhtar.
Okay.
He's also Mir. He had asked, is faith a part of Lalla Azwaq? I think something like that is what he had asked.
Is faith a part?
Or
Yes, very much so.
part of a particular faith to follow Lalla. I think that is what he meant, or something like that. I've forgotten the question now, but it was linked to religion.
Of course, yeah. It is, because her quest is what I would call a religious quest. I mean, there's no question of that. Yeah, it is a part, but it's a faith that is not predefined. It's something that she quests for, that she discovers, that she makes as she goes along. She makes her path. And I think, to me, that's the kind of religious imagination that remains urgent and current and inspiring. Not the kind where you conform to a dogma or doctrine that's already in place and you don't have to think very much about it. But the kind of doubt that involves thought, the kind of faith that involves doubt and questioning and discovery, I think that is what is vital. And there is place for that in every religious tradition in the world.
There is, this question is from Vinita. Ranjit, could you read us a poem from the Atlas of the Lost Beliefs, please?
Okay. All right. To look for it.
That would be lovely, because even I haven't.
But actually, it is the UK. I mean, give or take a few poems. It's the UK edition of Jonah Whale. So you do know the poems, most of them. They were meant to come out at the same time, but with one thing and another, it's emerged now, and it's a new avatar of the book. So I'm going to maybe read a poem that I haven't actually read to anyone before. So let me think about it. Oh yeah, here we are. This poem is called Bactrian Drachma, and it's really a reflection on an Indo-Greek coin. That's where it begins. On one side, a face that's been kissed, spat on, spun in bright air. Basileos, tyrant mining dry valleys, far from Homer's wine-dark sea. On the other, rimmed by a halo of worn ass-lip script, Tratara, a cave-born echo, never heard the same twice, never fully deciphered.
Beautiful, beautiful.
Thank you. I thought I would read that because I've never actually read this poem to an audience. And it also goes back into exactly the kind of thing we've been talking about: histories that are shared, that have more than one side. So take this Bactrian coin. There's a Greek inscription on one side that says emperor in Greek. Flip it around. On the other side is a Sanskrit word that means savior.
And this takes me back to the conversation we had on the Heliodorus pillar.
Yes, my God, yes, absolutely. Yeah, that was for me. I mean, that entire trip to Bhopal and environs was Very, very special indeed. I mean, the Heliodorus column I've known since I was a child, known of it. But to go there and to be in its presence was magical, really, because it took you back, 2 millennia to
Yes.
a Greek ambassador arrives. He is a Vaishnav. He belongs to a group of people who for the first time have worshipped a deity called Vasudeva. And there's the column. I mean, it used to have a Garuda on it, which doesn't exist anymore. But there's a kind of magic and a potency to what is otherwise a relic. And it's not a rallying point for a defensive identity. It's the opposite. It's a rallying point for an inclusive, plural identity. You stand in front of that pillar and you say to yourself, right, I belong to a culture and a civilization that has been nourished by many different rivers. And I think that's the reason why we need to cherish these monuments, because each one of them reminds us of how plural, how kaleidoscopic we are.
And nowadays that is called Hum Baba. And
I know.
So I remember, asking ki Hum Baba kaun hai, because when I went, I saw all the road signs call it Hum Baba. None of them
Right.
call it your column. They call it Hum Baba. So I was wondering, who's
That's
this
true.
Hum Baba? And then I was told that this is a pillar, and that's how from Udaygiri I went there.
Right.
The question by I don't know what the name is, but he says he or she, when we encounter each other, you usually start with the indifference. Does translation abide by it?
I'm sorry, Rana, I don't think I got that. We begin with?
I haven't understood that. Can you please explain it again? I think your name, MUBE, that's the name given on the handle. It says when we encounter each other, you usually start with the indifference. Does translation abide by it?
Speaking of the act of translation, I think it begins with the opposite of indifference. I mean, as a translator, you're enchanted or intrigued by a text. There's already a challenge there. There's a curiosity about how this text works, how it renders its magic, and how you might bring it into the language you work in. So I don't think there can be any place for indifference in the act of translation. Translation is always an act of devotion.
And something you're invested in, that's why you believe in, that's why you want to spend
Absolutely.
so much time. Translation,
Absolutely.
I've just done, I think, 3 books, but they were very difficult because you have to understand not only the nuances, you want to explain, and I've been translating old text, so explain
Yes.
what they meant, what were the nuances that they were living with. So it is quite a tedious, I shouldn't say tedious, but it's a labor of love.
It is a labor of love. It's also, you are deeply responsible to the text, to its author, and to the life world from which the text comes. So there's also a very strong ethic involved in translation, or should be.
Yes, absolutely. And I remember I had taken up translation. The first thing I translated was Dastane Ghazal. And I thought, coming from a historical background, it won't be all that difficult. But when I started translating, I realized there was so much to it that I just couldn't understand, because many of the words are no longer in use. And the Zahir Delvi uses a couple of terms which are very, उस दिन लड़ाई हुई. Now, what was that day and which was the लड़ाई? So to discover that, to research that,
Yes.
it took a long time. So when I'm writing something myself, I know exactly what I mean, so I can explain it. But to
Yes.
try to get into somebody else's mind and explain what they had in mind, that is always a challenge. So it
True.
is something only when you are very, very committed.
That's true.
Asking, and he asked in the last session also, I forgot to ask, what have you been reading lately?
Oh my goodness. I have to look around. All kinds of things, frankly. I just finally, now that the postal services and the couriers are coming back into action, I've just got a new set of books. But what I've been reading in the last few months is really either revisiting things that have been important to me. For instance, the collected poems of W.S. Graham. Now, he's someone I responded very strongly to. I discovered him when I was 20 years old. And the way in which he detonated syntax and the way he handled image was so amazing to me then. I think I internalized it. Then, for years I didn't read Graham at all, and for some reason I was reminded of by his work. So I've been reading W.S. Graham for sure. I've also been rereading Tony Joseph's early Indians, and I've been really going back into some of those debates about where we come from, who we might be. But that's two things. Then there's been a great deal of poetry that I've been revisiting. I've been rereading Adrienne Rich. She's someone whose work I've traveled with for a long time. And then there's a lot of other reading that's been happening. But I would maybe hold on to these three for now.
And Smriti has a question. Ranjit, what gives you hope in humankind and best intentions of men, yes, mostly men, in these troubled times?
What gives me hope? Oh my goodness. Very little gives me hope in terms of the way our social and political systems seem to be geared. To be quite honest, I think there was a point at the end of last year and the beginning of this one where it seemed as though there was ground for a great transformation. But I'm afraid in these months of lockdown, the more I think about it, that the forces of the status quo have simply not understood that what they're committed to is actually the destruction of a society, a country, and an environment. It's amazing that this is not just us. I mean, this is everywhere in the world. So it's a kind of pessimistic conclusion to come to, but I think most of us are mind. It's tragic to see how systems that could be geared for transformation are actually simply continuing with our march towards species annihilation and planetary annihilation. Sorry, Smriti, you were probably hoping for, I should probably say, but there's still literature. I think even as we're on our way to wherever we're going, what gives me hope personally, honestly, is really literature, I have to say, the more I think about it. The way in which the possibilities and the vulnerabilities of the human subject are, I have to say, Underland, Robert Macfarlane's book, that has been with me through these months. It's many of our listeners here will have read the book, but it's one of those books that gives me great hope, because across the world there are people like Robert Macfarlane, not least in our own country, who are fighting the good fight in terms of the large ecological struggles. So yes, that gives me hope. What gives me hope is that there still are people who are committed to equity in agriculture, to ecological reform, to understanding how we need to live with and retrieve older forms of wisdom concerning forests, water bodies. I mean, and there are so many, we were talking about social media earlier. It's really on social media, for instance, that I discovered some of these people. I mean, someone like Ravi Agarwal I've known for a long time. Someone like Amitangshu Acharya, who is doing sterling work on the rivers of India, on water. He's someone I met over Twitter. So there is, let's also, I mean, there is toxicity in social media, but there are also marvelous things. It has the potential to be a symposium.
I find social media, of course, it is toxic, but that depends on how you use it. I have made some very good friends. For example, I'm on social media, and
Indeed.
That, concentrate on the learning part of it. That
yes.
Learn the various people, and just I keep blocking. I have blocked over 6,000 people.
Oh my God.
Negative, yes, and carry on, because these people should not disturb our equilibrium, because we have to also nourish ourselves to be able to fight and carry on.
Exactly.
So there's a question by Balakrishnan. He asks, is there a specific poem of Lal Ded that you picked up many times but never managed to translate and let it remain in its original tongue, or took the most time to translate?
I wouldn't isolate any. It's a very good question, actually. Thank you for the question. Um, I wouldn't isolate any single poem, but I'll respond by sharing an experience. You know, when I first engaged with the Varks, I was at a different kind of position in my understanding of spirituality and what was most important from a social and a political point of view. In brief, I was really a student still, and I was very much on the left. So my question then was, what am I going to do with a lot of this vocabulary that very clearly comes out of a system of belief, or it comes out of some cosmological system? The great experience for me across the 20 years, well, much earlier than 20, was to realize that as a translator, I need to bear witness to what the original author was doing. It's not about my politics. Meanwhile, my politics changed as well, largely through, I think, as I said earlier, through these meetings and encounters with many of them were Buddhist thinkers, I have to say, that there was this much larger sense of what kind of force, what kind of healing force spirituality could be. And as I opened myself to the original text, I realized that there was actually, I have to use a Sanskrit word, there was a sahaj way of rendering these translations. I had to be true to them. And I just found that instead of going into contortions to find material explanations for many of these images, I just had to say what they were. And when I did that, their materiality became very, very clear. So whether it was the kumbhak exercise that was being spoken of, whether it was the rise and fall of the breath, like the bellows, in each of these images, paradoxically, my openness to their inner spiritual meaning actually made them available as strong, concrete, material images. And for me, that was the learning, that was the humbling. And as a translator, that's how I think I really learned a great deal from this long ago author whose work I was translating.
That's really very, very well said.
Thank you.
Mir Mukhtar has one more question. He says, have you observed that these pious souls have preached searching of God, not concept of God? They search through karma, good deeds.
Yeah, absolutely. As I said earlier, I think for me, it's that nature, it's that quality of quest, of search, which is important to me in the mystical quest, in poems that come from the wisdom or the mystical traditions. Because they don't always start with, even when the divine makes its presence felt in Ghalib or in Mir, it's under a sign of questioning. It's under a sign of irony. Sometimes the orthodox hierarchies are laughed at. The poet plays the divana, the kalandar. These are roles that are assumed by both these poets at different times. So we're also being told that there is an oblique point of entry. You don't have to go in through the authorized gateway of enlightenment. Enlightenment can find you from some other angle.
Very true. And any more questions? Does anybody have? Because I think we've taken all the questions. नमस्ते हिंदी पूछ रहे हैं, साहित्य की बातें तो ठीक है, पर आपका क्या कहना है, लॉकडाउन कब खत्म होगा? अब हम लोग निजूमी नहीं है। रंजीत इसके ऊपर
I wish I knew. I mean, like all the rest of us, I have absolutely no idea when this is going to end. But I think it will transform our understanding of our experience completely. Again, I'm not sure how. It's a hunch. But yeah, this experience is going to mark us. And I think it will also mark a much younger generation that has had its way of life interrupted in these months. But this is the future we're going to have to discover. So absolutely no answers yet.
That there's a lot of introspection that has been going on in everybody's during these months. We have to scale down. There's so much, like now that, I used to be out almost every day. Now these past 4 months, I've probably just gone out 2 or 3 times. And
exactly, yes.
something that is, teaching me that तो कहते हैं ना स्थिरता जिसको कहते हैं कि एक ठहराव आ जाता है
बिल्कुल, absolutely.
Now is coming into life now, and I hope everybody, I'm sure everybody has had their own experiences of how to cope with staying in, how to cope with the changing circumstances. As you said, everybody has to learn, and it's just not mentally but economically also. There is a lot of
True.
change, and we have to scale down. And as you said, you talked about the earlier session about the environment, about the birds and the bees coming back, the tree, the animals and all claiming back their habitat.
True.
All happening, and now we have to make sure that we continue like that. We don't. The first part of your question where you said that it should not be a dominance of one species over another.
Yes. True.
So I think we can end on this question. He is asking, what do you say to young poets and writers, even the not so real ones? And his handle is I
Ah, okay. Well, I think poet is as poet does. I mean, I don't think there's someone who hands you the title. You have to work for it. The question was, what is my advice for poets? Oh dear, I have no particular advice, but I think I would simply pass on the advice of previous generations, which is that if you're going to be a poet, you need to take that seriously as a discipline, which means that especially people who are starting out in poetry, you really need to read and hear as much poetry as you possibly can. There has to be that long outward arc of replenishing, of energizing and replenishing yourself with the tradition that you're part of, because I think there's altogether too much of a focus on ideas of spontaneity and immediate emotional articulation. All these are very important parts of poetry, but it's an art like every other art. I mean, if you wanted to be a potter, you can't just sit in front of the wheel and slap some clay around and hope for the best. You're not going to make any parts that way. If you were a sculptor, if you think that you can just go and have a shot at the furnace or a piece of marble, it's not going to work like that. So for me, I have a very artisanal understanding of poetry. You have to apply yourself to those forms of making. I mean, poiesis in Greek means making, right? So we are makers. We have to know how to make.
And that's a very good advice, because like, as you said, it's like any art form, you have to learn the craft. And
yes.
The craft, whatever you do, you have to learn the craft and you have to give it your best in whatever you
Absolutely.
do. Poetry, it could be anything. And Vijay had asked me also what I'm reading. Digvijay, these days I'm reading a book called The Lost Enlightenment by Frederick Starr. And I have also been rereading a lot of books, and the book that I read a few pages every night is Farooqui Saab's The Mirror of Beauty.
Lovely.
From it every night. It gives me a lot of, takes me back into another world. Plus, I've been, of course, reading for my work. So that is mainly history. I read Ira's Akbar the Great Mughal, then Moin Mir's Surat, Rise of Fall of a Pawn, Rise of a Prince. So these are the books that I've been reading. Also, all the conversations that I've been having, I've been reading their books. I read The Astonishing Reign of Noor Jahan. So these are the books that I've been reading, mostly related to history. And a few Sufism, as I said, The Lost Enlightenment. And then I read, which I really liked a lot, was William Chittick's The Vision of Islam.
Yes.
Beautiful book. And I've been listening to a lot of videos. That is something that I've come to, I've just recently discovered in the lockdown that there's so much of learning on videos. So I've been listening to videos, and there are a couple of handles. There's one handle called, it's a young boy who runs a handle called Let's Talk Religion, and he talks about all religions and the philosophy of religion. So I've been listening to a lot of his videos, especially on Sufism. So he talks a lot of sense. So I've been doing that, listening to music and chatting, working, and of course, tweeting. So that is my relaxation. And as I said, I do it, I engage only with people who have something to add to my life. So I don't, I do go and have fun there, but I have so many friends whom I made there, but I try to, give something and take something. Okay, Balakrishnan has one more question, and this I think should be
Okay.
the last. How often do you leave the phrases or words as they are in the original, untranslated as to say?
Okay. Very rarely, I have to say, because I do believe that if you're going to translate, I think then you address yourself to the challenge of bringing that word over into the shape of thought, the shape of language that you're working with. But there are times when there's no option, because some words are just very, very resistant to translation. And occasionally, I think Radha and I have also compared such words. There are words like seemingly very simple words like zamana. I mean, what is zamana? Is it the world? Is it a period of time? Is it zeitgeist? Is it a mood? A generation? Zameen, seemingly simple word. Once again, uh, these are, it's like a whole spectrum within a word. So how do you do that? So what I tend to do as a translator in the face of such challenges is to choose what seems most pertinent to the context of the passage or the poem, and I then rely on the other apparatus that's available to me as a translator. Annotations, a glossary sometimes, because also as a translator, I don't believe that everything begins and ends with the text alone. I mean, I'm not going to enshrine the text as some kind of, absolutely oraticized object. Uh, I like the fact that as translators, we are also able to share other things with our readers. For instance, and I tend to be a kind of obsessive annotator. So whether it's in Ilala or in the edition of Dombore's selected poems that I edited, I like to bring out the context of where the poem comes from, what the references might be. So the excess that you can't capture in the phrase, you can always indicate that through this other apparatus that's available to you. So I would see translation as also a set of activities.
So that's even, I also feel the same way that, if we don't explain that context, supposing
Yes,
that was written 200 years ago, the
correct.
reader will find it difficult and wonder what it is that the original and writer wanted to say. And as translators, it is our duty to try and convey as faithfully as we can what the original writer wanted to say. So
Absolutely.
now I'll give you one example. Like for Dastane Ghadar, the Dehlvi has used a lot of Quranic allegories and symbology. So just as you have a lot of biblical references in any of the classic English classics. So in one place when he's talking of the sepoys who come on the 11th of May, and he says कि सूरज सवा नेज़े के ऊपर था. तो सवा नेज़े के सर के ऊपर सूरज होना is a sign of क़यामत. So to explain that, so I can say
Yes.
I did write that the sun was a yard and a quarter above the head, but then I took a lot of pains to explain from which Quranic verse this has come from and what does
Right.
it, so that the reader understands that this is what it means. Otherwise, they'll wonder why should the savaneze ke upar kyun wo hai, and what does the neza mean itself in the first place.
Right.
So these are things that yes, as translators and whoever, I think Balakrishnan is very interested in translation. So all the best in case you're thinking of that. So you have to be as faithful as you can and to the thing. But yes, in some places, Ambar is here. Ambar was my editor for that, and
Mine
and
too.
whole experience with Amber, and then a couple of places Amber would tell me, yes, this is how it should be. So yes, you have to be as faithful, but yes, a couple of places to enrich the experience, make the experience for the reader a little better. You do have to take and then explain. So any more questions anybody has? Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Ranjit, so much for taking
Thank
out time.
you. Not at all. Really enjoyed this.
Looking forward
Thank
to
you.
histories now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thanks, Rana.
Thank you.
Take
And
care.
thank you.
Thank you.
And I'll be putting this up. Of course, it will be available on IGTV. Plus, I'll be putting it up on YouTube. By tomorrow, it
Super.
will be. So all those
Great.
who want to hear it it will be there forever. Thank you, Ranjit. Bye bye.
Take
Good
care.
night.
Thank you. Bye. Good night.
Okay.